everyone, to another episode of Plug and Pay. This is a talk show where we have insightful payroll leaders come onto our program and talk with us about interesting topics, things that are happening in the global payroll space. And my name is Marc-Oliver Fiedler. I'm founder and CEO of Payzar. And today I'm very excited to have with me on the program Joe Ranzau. Joe is global workforce transformation leader and a partner at Grant Thornton. Joe and I go a little ways back, and I'm really excited, Joe, to have you on the program today. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So what we always like to do, Joe, when we get started, when we have new guests on the program, is just learn a bit about the person, your background, what's brought you to the big fun world of global payroll.
Sounds, sounds reasonable. So I like to start out with folks by saying I'm a recovering HR executive. So I've typically, as a consultant, I've been in their shoes. By recovering, thrilled every day that I get to help affect change in HR, but the actual day-to-day HR is not my responsibility as we go through. I'm just really passionate about org development and organizational change. I've never met something I didn't want to transform. And so consulting made perfect sense, really focused on operational transformation. Along the way, though, someone discovered my illicit HR past and drugged me back in. And you asked about how I found myself in payroll. I think like 90+% of people, we fall into payroll. Sometimes we desperately try to get out of payroll for a while. I know from talking to executives that, hey, I never understood, why do I have this? Why am I responsible for it? And I didn't really like it. And now, 10, 15 years later, I couldn't imagine myself doing anything differently. And I think I'm pretty much the same there. For me, one of the major hooks was the multinational focus. There's always a problem to solve, always a complexity, and I love travel. I love working with other cultures. I love those different experiences, and that keeps me motivated. And I'm usually asked like maybe what's the most unique payroll you've ever run, maybe one of the most challenging. Again, as a consultant and a provider, my clients are running these. Probably the most unique for me was Antarctica. The research bases in Antarctica, and this was pre-pandemic. I'm old. It was back in the days where they didn't really even have payment cards. There wasn't good internet down there. And so literally we were figuring out how to get briefcases full of $100 bills down to Antarctica to give an advance on the paycheck. Part of it went to their bank accounts, part of it was essentially cash that they could then use and spend. So, definitely an interesting challenge, or most unique rather. And then from challenging, I would say it was actually a workforce management project where 70 plus countries, more than 120 time and attendance providers, and we smashed that into one over the course of about 18 months. Fairly challenging from a executive sponsorship perspective, just that sheer will to make this work when there's a ton of reasons why it maybe shouldn't work. Ultimately successful, not without hiccups, but definitely one of the more challenging projects.
That I can imagine. That sounds massive. And I love the story about it was Antarctica, right? You said or Arctica.
Antarctica, yeah, it's south.
Antarctica.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. Well, either way, the very physical challenges that can get in the way of getting people paid is quite unusual for sure. So obviously you've had a lot of different experiences, Joe, and you're in your role as a consultant, as an advisor. You talk to a lot of executives in various different organizations. So for today's session, we want to focus on that dimension of looking at payroll a bit through the lens of the executives, um, and I suppose explore that bit along the vendor landscape and some of the trends and changes we're seeing there, the perspective on changing delivery models, technology, how that plays into it, um, and always sort of uh, look at that through the lens of how does someone who makes decisions within the broader organization, how do they think about some of these challenges and topics and dimensions of the payroll operating environment. Um, and maybe to start there, just to kind of set the scene for us a bit. So when you're talking with HR leaders, change management, transformation leaders at these global organizations, what is their perspective? And I know it probably varies quite a bit depending on the person you have in front of you and their experience and their background. But if there is a way to kind of abstract it and generalize a bit, what is the common perceptions or perspectives on payroll from the leaders that you're talking with? What are their concerns? What are their goals, ambitions when they're looking at or thinking about payroll for their organizations?
Sure. So, what I like to do is start out with differentiating the types of executives. So and actually, I think size of the organization matters. The larger the organization, the higher up they are, the more removed they are from the day-to-day nuances of payroll. Even if they owned it at one point, innovation, while it has missed a lot of us, has continued to bring payroll along on a journey, and they're further removed from that. In addition, your finance execs are most closely, so say CFO, controller, chief accounting officer, assistant controller, they're most focused on risk. Some revenue impact, some budgeting and forecasting. Risk is their major focus point, and that regulatory compliance risk, the risk of payroll not processing, the risk of not being able to balance, pay people wrong, et cetera, really gets them motivated. Versus our CHROs, while risk is important to them, regulatory compliance is important to them, employee experience is important to them.
Hmm.
Okay, how do you differentiate employee experience with a paycheck, right? I either got paid correctly or I didn't get paid correctly. Is what maybe the cynical approach. But there are ways to make an individual's payroll more approachable. There's technology, so you ask, and I know we'll get into it later. We're starting to see some actually really cool trends with AI actually explaining someone's pay stub to them and some of the tax consequences or benefits consequences of making certain changes. And I know folks are going to get uncomfortable with that because we're not giving tax advice most commonly as payroll professionals, at least in the US. However, what it does do is help explain their options relevant to them, not some agnostic pay stub that doesn't have their situation. And we're actually seeing in the testing that it's about 3% more accurate than a human. So a human explaining things is most commonly 95% accurate, and
Hmm.
the AI, when trained properly with the right compliance and constraints in place, about 98% accurate, explaining someone's benefits, pay, et cetera, to them. All right, so different types of executives: employee experience from HR, finance, really risk focused, operations, which is I need to get something done. I want my team motivated. Maybe I have a billing component, right? So it's a services organization, which means I can't charge my customer until I get people paid, and then I can reconcile that and put it out into an invoice. So they're looking for better, faster, and then usually there's overhead, so they want it cheaper. How do we make that happen? All right, so those are my execs. Almost universally, I get, why isn't this easier? Simply put, I thought we could push a button when we could run payroll. What's going on?
Right.
I think there's a few reasons for this. There's a lack of understanding around just what it takes from a data perspective, right? So average payroll, and I'm generalizing, but I see on average for single payroll, single legal entity, 8 to 15 systems and data sources have to come together to run that one payroll. And none of the data is consistent. The unique identifiers are all over the place. The pay elements are all different, and payroll usually spends most of their time sorting through it, aggregating it, getting it normalized so that they can put it into payroll rather
Right.
than having an approach with global elements that can simplify this. We feed it all in and make it work. So that's a big one. Why isn't it easier? Like we should have simplified this. I also think, especially the larger corporations, tell themselves stories. Hey, we've implemented one HCM system, universal.
Exactly. Yeah.
It does everything. Well,
Right.
no, let's go ahead and talk about Germany. Let's talk about India. Let's talk about some of the different things we're tracking over in France. You have an HCM, but you're building shadow HCM around it to accommodate, or your teams did minimum viable product and we left the legacy in place, which I see a lot in order to make it happen. And you have a dozen manual processes in order to move things through. Um,
Plus, there's a lot of things that will not end up in your HCM system, even with
correct.
the most personalized or localized implementation. Things like your commissions, right, that need to be get paid and correctly taxed and all that,
Fleet
most
charges.
likely will not sit in your Workday or SuccessFactor or Oracle system. That sits somewhere else. Yeah,
Right. License plate numbers are required in certain countries from a tax and benefits perspective, and they don't most commonly travel through, especially if it was a US based implementation that is now trying to be used multinationally,
right.
that we can't get through there. I get a lot of, why can't this operating model be consistent? Why can I have one payroll processor for 2,000 employees in the US, but I require one payroll processor for 150 in France?
Hmm.
I have three times the payroll team to run a much smaller entity in France than I do to run the US. Help me understand that challenge, and why we can't put it together. And then, again, all of this, it again is about the risk. And what I'm most commonly getting is I actually don't know what my risk is. I feel like it's a little bit unstable. I feel like the payroll team's working right up to the deadline every single time. And I'm hearing a lot of problems. And IT says they're fixing things, but a perfect example, and they'll know if they listen who they are. But I have a client that's literally taking Lotus Notes, running a payroll on Lotus Notes today. Um, I was surprised. I don't know why I was surprised. I was surprised. And we're porting it to Windows 10. So Lotus Notes to Windows 10. Lesser of two, negatives probably, but still not where I would necessarily port the platform if I was going to solve the issue. And again, IT seeking the minimum viable to mitigate the problem in front of them rather than strategically scalable because again, it's payroll, it's a back office, it's not necessarily a focus of investment. And then finally, I know this was really long-winded, apologies. It's that unknown. They don't necessarily, and this is where I and a few other folks have been really trying to make a push to help educate from an executive perspective. You don't have to be a payroll expert. You
Hmm.
have to apply governance like you apply to every other area of the organization. You need to ask the right questions. You need to set a strategy, have a team in place, remove barriers to help them. But it's that fear of the unknown and where should I focus? Because I'm that unfamiliar or I'm that uncomfortable with the concept of payroll, where do I start as we have these conversations? So those are some themes, and
Yeah,
I'm
no, those are great, and I think some of them I'd look to unpack a bit more, um, and dig into those. One of the things you just talked about is that perception from an executive perspective. Why does this have to be so complicated? Um, why could I have just one vendor that solves the problems for me across my international footprint? And so zooming in a bit on the vendor landscape, obviously it's been changing over the last little while. There's new entrants in the market. New technology, new delivery models. Certainly since COVID, I think there's been quite a bit of change going on, and even pre-COVID, admittedly. Um, these days, we're all talking a lot about AI, and we'll talk, how technology comes into the picture, both through the vendors and also within the organization. But just thinking about the vendor landscape a bit, what kind of trends are you seeing, and how's that um, shift or changes that are coming about? How's that kind of being driven through um,
sure.
the views of the executives?
So I think those are two different things. How am I seeing it change versus the views of the executives? So I'm seeing it change really. There's a significant amount of disruption that I wasn't expecting coming out of the fintech space. So these organizations that started as finance companies that realized it was cheaper, faster, easier to align to their business model to create their own payroll engines. And right, wrong, or indifferent, most of them chose to do this without what I would say is the baggage of decades and decades of rigor, structure, and approaches of the legacy incumbents. And so that's good and bad because you're going to break things when you're not understanding the lessons of the past. However, the great is you're also not constrained by those, and so you're able to break into new, more innovative ways of running payroll. And so, without necessarily wanting to name any of those particular providers, a lot of them started as employers of record. Some of them started maybe with earned wage access, so they went back and forth. And then a lot of them frankly, are building out their own engines as fast as they can. Now, don't get me wrong, some of them that claim to be disrupting are just using in-country providers like everyone else, and they're the same, mismatched network of ICPs that you see a lot of them doing. However, I do see some truly making some changes there. Now, what you're also seeing in that space is that those entrenched incumbents have some decisions to make. The irony in some of those instances is they were the disruptors 20 years ago that took out entrenched incumbents. So if
Mm,
I think about Workday, for instance, Workday was the upstart. Um,
mm,
and or if I think about Success Factors was an upstart. You saw SAP step in with Success Factors. Workday's been able to scale, and now all of those companies are acquiring. If I think about some of the more innovative, you saw UKG recently introduce OneView where they picked up Amidas, or I know we saw the deal with Safeguard recently. Being acquired to go over into another organization. So we're starting to see that. I might be focusing myself a little bit too much on the US, but we're seeing these entrenched providers realize that they don't want to go the way of Kodak or Blockbuster Video in the US, where Blockbuster had the chance to acquire Netflix.
mm,
Actually, for a really reasonable price, chose not to, and ultimately doesn't exist. Not
mm,
many IPs around anymore like Kodak has, and they laughed at the competitor, said it would never make a difference, and it spawned an entirely new industry and took them out. So I see that change coming. Now, do I think that's AI doing it? I do not. Now, I think AI is perhaps lowering the development cost, lowering the test cost for some of these providers. And you may have an opinion on that, right? Developing software, or Trevor, I know, is in the trenches there, developing
yeah,
software. But
no.
I am seeing it accelerate there. It's coming for parts of payroll. I'm not seeing it disrupt, but we'll turn the tables.
Oh,
Back to you
well,
for.
I think AI will certainly play a big role with everything that relates to the technology enablement of the industry. But I think we're also conscious of the fact that technology is just one part of the overall
It is.
equation, right? AI is not going to replace um, everything that makes up payroll, right? There's a lot of dimensions to it, and certainly I think is starting to play a big role in terms of um, the more transactional mechanical aspects of it, and the data collection and data transformation and those kind of things. I think it can have a huge benefit. But I think we're in the early stages of really making it work. And then I think there's a
Right.
lot more to payroll than just solving some of the foundational technology challenges as well.
Yeah, so I view it from a risk and quality control lens. If you can get AI that could actually schedule me a meeting across, three executives in a reasonably easy way, you'll have made my life better, much less innovating payroll. Think about the
Right.
time it took us to schedule, this conversation,
Yeah.
and AI is capable of it, but it's not yet being deployed at an cross enterprise level where something as simple as coordinating meetings is being accommodated. Do I think it'll come? Absolutely.
For
I
sure.
do
For
think
sure.
one other thing I wanted to hit on the vendor landscape is that I'm going to use the word finally, though I'm not convinced it's final. We're finally seeing some maturity in the market where we're now seeing providers focus on mid to small size enterprise that whether it was the pandemic, whether it's just embracing a global workforce, we're starting to see have a multinational presence and build those payroll engines in. Obviously it's not prolific yet, but the most recent one I've come across was HiBob. That has rolled out a payroll engine in a couple of countries. One that's been around for a while, Niamo, is definitely starting to mature their product, bring in a time and attendance function, roll out some AI. So I mean, I'm seeing movement into that space, which I think is great because what you were experiencing before is those smaller companies were essentially beholden to a network of service providers because they weren't necessarily able to manage. Now, there's still decision making they have to do to decide, do I want that risk? Do I need to make sure I staff that expertise or am I willing to pay a little bit more? But for those that are in the maybe awkward teenage years of growing, where they're capable and able to do a little bit more themselves, we're finally seeing some tools outside of, say, ADP that their traditional products that are going to allow them to take more control if they want to take more control.
Mhm. So if we dig into that a little bit deeper, look at the vendors and different types of um, positioning and approaches. So some vendors, they differentiate themselves based on technology. Others, put more of the local subject matter expertise in the foreground, or compliance and tax expertise. So when you're talking with executives, what are some of the things that really light up on their agenda, and what are they looking for from a vendor as they're making decisions about who to partner with, and what's most important for their agenda, for their objectives that they're trying to achieve for their organization?
Sure. So I'm going to go to a couple of reactions I have to that question. I've yet to, in a decade plus of doing this, enter into these discussions where cost isn't a major consideration. Now, sometimes it's number two or number three, but there's always a cost play. And by the way,
Hmm.
rarely do I find payroll savings to be quote unquote sexy from a cost play. In fact, for most folks, if you're coming from a legacy platform that you've owned for more than a decade, you were on a one-time license fee with maintenance, unless it's an ongoing service provider, and now you're going to, a monthly SaaS fee, right? And so you have savings in infrastructure and networks, et cetera, but that goes to IT. That doesn't
Hmm.
go to the payroll team, and then all of a sudden you have this new licensing, and it gets, by the way, that IT cost gets sort of peanut butter spread across the organization. And now all of a sudden you're shifting into a model where you're going to have a very real specific licensing cost directly tied to your tower, and that can create some challenges.
So
Um,
that makes it actually harder than for payroll
yeah,
function to push for a new solution, because suddenly when they make that change, they're going to have to somehow absorb the cost more directly than previously, where it was just kind of spread across or hidden somewhere, or it was a one-time investment at the time anyways.
absolutely real challenge. And in a lot of ways, we're following best practices in procurement from 10, 15 years ago that companies are finally catching up to, right? Which is we're going to shift tech costs to IT. We're going to try to differentiate. The reality
Mhm.
is, from a payroll perspective, though, it's tech and service. Even in a very basic implementation where
Mhm.
you're running most things, that technology vendor is providing updates to rate tables. They're providing subject matter experts that are helping you with certain types of garnishments or deductions to payrolls. They may provide printing services that a lot of people in this time and date still print for whatever reason. And or they might even be providing tier one contact services, but we're buying it through the lens of an IT decision rather than an operational decision that has a service provider that also brings a technology platform to the table, and we're measuring it. And by the way, this is no different than AI, and how AI is rolling into organizations right now. We're measuring it like any other IT purchase, like Microsoft Office, rather than what it actually is for organizations. I would also then, okay, so that's one thing. I think that's some self-imposed pain from the vendor landscape, and I'm going to pick on everyone's favorite, which ADP. Back in the 1950s, when they partnered with the precursor to IBM to create one of the first computerized payrolls, right? It has snowballed since then that every company is unique. We don't have consistency across elements, earning codes, et cetera. And maybe that I'm not commenting on whether or not that's been good for their business model, but I do think it's made it a challenge for us. And going back to your, executive conversation, I do get asked a lot about why we can't just have a single platform for my payroll. Why do I have to have all of these things in place? And in fairness, if you're a simple organization, right? You don't have a lot of complexity. You're willing to conform to your provider, and you're willing to conform to how that provider does business, change things about how you operate. Then sure, there's a couple of them out there that probably work pretty well for your needs. But if you're an established organization, um, And most multinationals of any size, they're entrenched in how they've done things. They've had a lot of M&A activity, mergers and acquisitions with lack of integration, even though they feel integrated. And that requires flexibility that these platforms don't work, which, quite frankly, while there's several providers in the space doing integration engines, compliance management, et cetera, yourself included, most of them want to either stay locked into their own network, meaning we'll give you this only if you buy our product, or
Mhm.
we're going to very closely align with one HCM system. And again, going back to where we talked about earlier, sure, companies have that one HCM system perhaps, but they have a lot of other inputs. And unless you have that extensibility in these larger, um, maybe even not larger, but in these legacy enterprises, you're not going to be able to simplify how you operate. And so I think that's a difficult decision. And again, from an executive perspective, that's a lot of nuance that is well into the weeds from where they want to exist day to day. And I think there's some reasons why there's a challenge with the payroll team, but we can get into that later, being able to explain, help take them on the journey about why, et cetera. So for me, I think there are one size or one provider solutions. But again, I don't know that they're right for most organizations. And the final place I would take you is what I see a lot, especially in the servicer space, is you're either going to go to lowest cost provider, or you've experienced a lot of pain in the past. Well, so a couple of things. One is you don't know, and so you're just out there and you're going to roll the dice and pick one. Two, it's procurement driven, budget driven. We're going lowest cost no matter what the consequence is. Or three, we've gone that route. We've done the years of cleanup and gone through the pain. And so we're going to spend a little bit more for what I would call a more specialty provider. Yeah, they're not going to be the cheapest, but we have confidence that they'll get it done with a minimal amount of pain. And I know I'm grossly oversimplifying, but those are sort of the three approaches. And I see fewer and fewer on the we're going to spend a little more because we know the pain
Mhm.
if we don't get it right.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, if I reflect on kind of where the payroll industry has come from, I think historically, um, you had to pick vendors where you were kind of looking for the best of the combination of deep service capability and payroll compliance tax expertise, and
Mhm.
then also the the technology capabilities, because obviously technology plays a big role in, no matter how you process payroll, whether you outsource it or run it in-house, or what specific tool you end up using. And I think over the last decade or so, that there's been an unbundling. And I suppose, speaking from our own perspective, we've been part of that unbundling of making it possible to, as you just said, you don't need to necessarily pick the premium vendor and go for that. You can be a lot more differentiated, right? And pick and choose vendors based on different needs across different parts of the organization. You probably need a very different support model, different solution for an entity where you have 5,000 employees versus an entity where you only have 10 employees. And I think what I find exciting about how the whole vendor supplier model has evolved is that I think there's more flavors in the market for these different customer pain points and different scenarios that customers are grappling with. It's no longer you pick one size fits all, and it's this vendor or that vendor, this color that I'm going to paint everything in, ADP red or whatever, different vendors, brand and solution. You can be a lot more targeted and selective in many ways.
You can. It requires a level of maturity within the payroll operation. And again, bring it back to the executive level. How do I know? And it's an entire conversation around operating model and what those levers are. Are we in a highly regulated industry? And this would apply to most things that we do, even AI. Are you highly regulated or not? That's the first thing you need to know because that's going to influence decisions that you make. Are we cost sensitive? Everyone is. How cost sensitive are we? Are we an ultra low margin business? Are we a regionally high margin or reasonably high margin? And we need to make good decisions somewhere in between. What's the size of the workforce? What's the regulatory complexity of the country? What's our union or workers' council footprint look like? Even down to the point of, and a lot of folks don't want to share this, how sensitive is operations management, right? Are they going to be screaming, from the rooftops every single day about something that maybe I have no control over? Or, are they reasonably laid back, get it done, timely, compliant, et cetera, but their expectations are different. And then again, how do we do that across it's not uncommon, especially if we're dealing with 25 to 50 countries. How do we do that across 100 legal entities? And how do I know which entity gets which model, where I insource it, I co-source it, or I outsource it,
Mm,
across all of those? Simple enough. It's a math problem, and how you go in, assign priorities to each one, but understanding which levers you want to use and which are more important to your organization takes conversation that your payroll team, stuck in that must not fail, must get right cycle,
mm,
7 to 30 days, doesn't necessarily, they know where some of the problems are. They know where most of the problems are, but they don't
mm.
have time to look up and help guide you on that journey. So that's
Right.
one of the things as an executive that you get to pull on. And again, I don't think that's different from how you make other operating model or delivery decisions, but I do think the nuances and how you pick and what you prioritize is something you're probably, especially if you haven't been in payroll a long time,
Yeah.
unfamiliar with.
Yeah. Well, that's why they need someone like you, Joe, right? They bring in the experts that have been around the industry and seen a few things and
And there's a
know how
lot
to
of
strategize.
there's a lot of different options in the space. There are plenty of folks that have reached the towards the end of their careers that are providing consulting services independent, coming into organizations with a wealth of knowledge. We can connect you to those. There are consultancies, from very small shops, single shingle type shops, all the way up to the big four and beyond that provide some pretty good expertise. It's making sure you find the right person with relevant experience in the space who's not selling you a product, but that is
Mm,
listening to what you need and helping challenge. And I'm probably jumping ahead, from a conversation perspective, but I get into the fact that as we make these technology decisions, so often organizations say, I need someone that is, I need a technology platform that is, in the US FLSA compliant, Fair Labor Standards Act. They're going to calculate overtime right. Or for my EU, I want GDPR compliance. Okay, great. You're wasting their time, my time, our collective time. Because if their product doesn't comply with the FLSA, or if their product isn't GDPR compliant, you
it
wouldn't
wouldn't be a vendor.
with them having that conversation. So,
Mm,
how do you understand what's unique about your organization that you're not going to change, that's going to break their product, and how are they going to accommodate it? I think is a much more nuanced conversation, and that takes some self-reflection about what those sort of deal breakers are. Because I can tell you, you're going to have a multitude of stakeholders, and you're going to have a lot of people saying no because it's their preferred way to do something. It doesn't
mm,
mean it's the right way. It doesn't mean it's the best way, the easiest way. It's just their way. So how do you know what you can break versus what you absolutely cannot touch? And that's where that upfront investment of time, bringing in a third party that has a reasonable deal of expertise that's independent. They're not trying to sell and get a kickback from a product on the back end to guide you and say, I hear what Marc is saying about his requirement. However, looking at the totality of the situation, we can still accommodate that five different ways. It's going to be a change. They'll have to learn something new, but it'll get you to the same end result, and then you can pick this product that satisfies for the 90% over here. And that's a discussion and a degree of nuance that I don't think a lot of organizations are good at. They may be good at in pockets, but I don't necessarily see that type of transformation and thoughtful conversation just being a skill set that a company has.
hmm And of course, so we're already, getting into technology, and I guess been kind of a theme throughout here, anyways. But in our industry, of course, right now there's a ton of talk about AI and integration solutions and automation and analytics, and we're seeing tons
Mhm.
of data, but we have all these different systems. So I'm curious, when you're in the boardrooms and you're talking to the executives, and these kind of conversation topics come up, around HR and payroll and how's that all going to change. Um, what are they looking for? What are their expectations? Are they expecting that, hey, everything's going to get solved through AI, and we're looking for vendors that have the best AI, gadgets that they're coming up with, or are they still skeptical about, how much that's really going to solve some of their challenges? And also,
There-
I guess, kind of thinking about this from a provider perspective, what do you think is important for providers to be able to demonstrate to executives in their conversations?
So there's a fair amount of tension between stated goals and the data in what we're seeing. So I'll address this from a couple of ways. And again, let's differentiate on the size of the organization. Your large, Fortune 100 or most dominant, organizations in the world have an enterprise strategy. They're deploying it. They're tackling costs. They're failing in plenty of places, but they are seeing good success in a few spots, and we'll talk about that. But when we talk about most of us and most of our companies, I'm going to pick on manufacturing. It's the most recent. I was speaking at a conference recently on this. Roughly 30% of manufacturers even have adopted an enterprise AI strategy. And when you look at the actual stats, only roughly 8% of department heads are using AI on a regular basis. Frontline management, 1% are using AI on a regular basis. It doesn't mean it's not deployed in pockets in the organization, but when 60% of enterprises haven't adopted a standard, it's all over the place. It's everywhere. Now, GT's CFO survey, we're seeing roughly mid 60 percentages. It varies a degree or two of CFOs continuing to say we're going to increase our IT spend. We're going to continue our investment into AI and driving this transformation. However, those same surveys show that those same organizations are either holding or reducing their spend when it comes to preparing the workforce and adoption. And when you look at the stats from a resistance perspective, majority of employees, so some of this is US, some of this is global. The majority of employees global feel unprepared to use the AI.
Mm.
The majority in the U.S. fear it's going to replace their jobs. Workers' protections are different, very abrupt transition cycles rather than defined through contracts for the majority, right? And so a lot more fear there. One of the other things that's a tension, and I realize I'm diving a little deep, so I'll bring it back, is the AI cycle's moving so fast, we can't do traditional training. If we were to spend 6 months
Mm.
rolling out a training program on something,
Sorry,
folks,
sorry, moved on.
AI is innovating about every 3 months right now. And multiple new tools are coming to market. So I'll go back and pick on Workday. Workday just announced 18 new AI agents and 3 AI acquisitions that they're deploying into their ecosystem. Well, again, you can't take 16 months to prepare your workforce on that. So what do? It's experiential learning for the most part, even all the way up to the board, by the way. The board governing the entire enterprise. It's experiential learning. It's helping understand sort of the guardrails of, where is this particular product good? Where is it not good? What are its strengths? How do you know if it's hallucinating? Which, by the way, is a challenge, just human nature in general. I don't know. I know I was saying this in Germany when I was over there because social media changes. I think we've lost Mark, so we'll give him a second to come back. Hey there. It was our intermission. Either that or I was boring you to death.
No, you know what happened? This has never happened before. So I'm looking at the screen, and 1 second to the next, it just everything went black. I'm like, huh?
If you want to have if you want to have bloopers. So when I think about AI and it being deployed to an organization, where I was going is it's the cycle is much faster. We can't do traditional training, and it's really about understanding the guardrails. And I think right where we dropped, I was introducing. So I was in Germany recently, and your social media changes based on the country you're in. At least I notice it does. But I
Yeah.
was still seeing the AI videos where they're really good right now, where someone had a little toddler out on the back porch, and in the U.S. we have alligators or crocodile. They're not. I'm not going to get into the distinction between them. Walking up to the porch with the baby on it, and mom comes out screaming. It's an AI fake. Or I'm a Chihuahua parent. I have the little barking dogs. There's a video making the rounds of a Chihuahua taking over a wolf pack. And like being the alpha in the wolf pack, and it shows like they're on game cameras going around, right? And people, folks in my community believe it. They're blown away, right? This is AI, and so I use those sort of as extreme examples. But how do we know what's right? How do we know where it's hallucinating? How do we know where it's accurate, it's directionally correct, et cetera? So there's great benefits from a compliance perspective. Again, I said at one point earlier I'm old. I relate it to, do you remember Microsoft used to have the little paper clip in the application, and it would tap on the screen to make a suggestion that you
Hmm.
something. This was back in the late so it was in the 1900s, Lord help us all. But in the 90s and the early 2000s, and his name was Clippy. I like that concept of co-working, where we're boosting productivity. It's looking through things. We're already seeing it, your product, we're seeing it in a variety of other cloud products where, hey, Joe's pay has changed from a threshold that we've set that we're not comfortable with. I need you to go take a look and understand what this change is and if it's good or not. Or, oh, hey, he got his 13th paycheck for whatever reason. Maybe he's in Brazil and he decided to go on leave. So yeah, the pay for the month changed, but here's why. So we're going to go ahead and understand and move it forward. Like AI is doing that today. Is it replacing us? Is it aggregating data in ways that make things simpler and that people are prepared for? It's not. I'm working on a European pay transparency project right now where another company's come in. They have a really great tool in order to generate the reports and produce the data. My client literally can't get the data together to get it in the tool. Because it's coming from so many disparate systems with lack of unique identifiers for transactions and not even complete names. The elements are all different through each system and transaction. We're using some AI, but again, my teams had to be upskilled on the AI. We have to get approvals to put the data through the AI, and we are able to move things forward faster than we might have in the past, but it's definitely a challenge.
There's the wolf pack being
Yeah,
chased
the
by
chihuahua, and I apologize about that. I think someone's
must
arriving.
have heard you and said, I'm taking action. I'm going after the wolf pack. And it's lingering outside of your house, apparently. I like how you that tied right into your talk track.
They'll
Doc,
get they'll get extra treats
yeah,
later. So
exactly. Right on cue. They're well trained. Um, But this brings up an interesting point, Joe, because you're talking about how the team needs to be trained, the data needs to be there. A lot of times we think, let's just bring in technology and that's going to solve everything, right? We're going to automate the heck out of it. We're going to AI it, and at the same time, we're seeing this in our own client engagements quite a bit. Um, Without the right change management around it, because technology will change the roles, the responsibilities, the processes. There's so many things that need to adapt to the new capabilities that we're introducing. And I wonder, in your conversations again with senior leaders in these organizations, um, is the awareness there for, okay, this is a more holistic thing that needs to happen throughout the organization than just let's bring in this tool or this vendor and then we'll have it all fixed and figured out.
I mean, I would say they're saying that. Again, going back to the data, it's not necessarily pulling through, but what we are finally starting to see is the success of projects that are cross-functional. And what I mean by that, so I wear another hat for Grant Thornton on AI and workforce impact. And so what we are starting to see is companies that realize that it can't be a, trench warfare type approach where one person's trying to do this. You need a cross-functional team. It's got to have operations, might need HR, definitely needs legal, risk, compliance, IT, and they need to have very defined scope and strong executive sponsorship to move something forward. We measure it differently. It's rarely still right now hard dollar savings. It's efficiency, quality increases, productivity increases, and that's hard because again, we're making this as an IT decision, so it needs to have a hard dollar savings in order to be approved. AI is not doing that yet most places. I can talk about somewhere it is. And the organization has to be prepared to bring it in because if you don't have control frameworks in place, if you don't have minimum requirements, this team's going to get through everything. And then someone in IT security is going to say, no, like just can't do it. We're not doing it. It's all on pause.
Right.
And then what you're going to find is shadow AI within the organization then pops up to make this happen. So it's out there. It is driving some benefit. So in your larger companies, really quickly, I know early on I talked about AI being able to translate pay stubs and provide value. We are seeing a huge impact to HR shared service for these larger enterprises, especially tier one, tier two inquiry, and those folks that are supporting there. Massive displacement. IBM tells their own story about this, and again, apologies for my compatriots downstairs. So IBM tells their own story about Watson, right, and rolling out their internal, that's not what they branded it, but their internal HR agent, and how they actually saw their net promoter score go negative within HR when they took away all means of processing an HR transaction outside of that agent. There's no longer an email, no longer a phone number. You use the agent and then it triggers things. Now that number is actually higher after, I'm going to make it up, 12 to 18-month journey where it went massively low. Now
Mhm.
that promoter score is actually higher, and they're seeing the majority of managers and employees never even log into the HCM platform anymore. They can process every transaction through the agent. And so folks like me, I don't want to talk to someone. I don't want to wait for an email. I want to get in, I want to get it done, I want an answer, I want to move on. Their satisfaction is actually higher. Now, that requires a level of executive support, commitment, and drive, and we're doing this at all costs that most organizations aren't going to embrace. So we've got to figure
And you
out.
think that that journey that they've gone through, first it dipped and now it's coming higher, it's ending up higher. Is that partly the sophistication, the learning that's kind of gone into the solution? The solution's got just gotten better, or is that driven more by the fact that people are getting more apt at how to interact with it and get more comfortable and, don't have maybe the same apprehensions that they had early on, which might have caused them
Yeah.
confusion, dissatisfaction, and
So I think it's a little bit of both. And what I mean with that is, so I do think we're becoming more tech savvy, right? And we can tell now when we're getting an old agent versus a new modern agent, right? The one where you used to have to yell the same request 4 different
right.
times and say, "Give me a human," or you press 0 relentlessly to try to get through. I experience that still where I'm employed, and the agent really, you ask for something, show me my pay stub. Well, here's a 10-step document on how to then manually go in and click 13 times to go find your pay stub rather than here's your latest pay stub. And so I do see the products improving. I also see the tech companies strategizing about how to release it. If you think about your phone and the tools that you use on a regular basis on your phone, they now mostly guide you. They don't give you a big training. You log in, it's like, hey, here's 3 new things I want you to see. It takes 7 seconds for you to look at them, or it just starts doing it. In the US, I take my boys to the movies quite often. My phone now says, hey, you're at the movies. Can I put you on Do Not Disturb? Like, that's AI. It's a different type of
Yeah.
AI. It's
Yeah.
AI. I find it really convenient versus there's a food app that I use that goes, hey, you're driving by your friend's house. You usually order this Thai food when you're going over there. Should I go ahead and place the order? That's intrusive. But it's
Mm.
the same AI being deployed in a way that I either find convenient or negative, and I think it depends on the application. So there's your consulting answer, maybe, and it depends for the discussion.
Very good. Well, listen, Joe, we've covered a lot of ground. Conscious of time, so just in the spirit of kind of bringing this to a wrap, any other thoughts you want to leave people with? Any shout outs, things you want to point people to look at, learn more?
Yeah.
Now's the time
No,
to.
happy to do so. So, let's go back to focusing on executives. This is overwhelming, right? So much to talk about. What I want you to know, and I say this with all sincerity, this is fun. You're solving enterprise-wide problems across HR, IT, finance, and the business. Yes, it has a payroll lens. Payroll, unless there's someone, just I'll go back to my old accounting days, fat fingering on the 10 key, right? For the most part, payroll works. What we're doing is solving things elsewhere in the enterprise, and it's across people, process, and technology. And so you know how to do that. You've been a leader in your organization. You've gone through those things. We're simply applying with a payroll lens. Be a lifelong learner. Clearly, you're listening, trying to find out more if you're hearing this conversation. Great resources out there, payroll.org, the Global Payroll Association, the CIPP in the UK, et cetera. I could continue to name, all of the different organizations. They provide a wealth of information that's out there for folks to benefit from. Understand that your employees in the payroll team running 100 miles an hour, they're not necessarily empowered to solve issues. They accommodate them. So reach down, help to understand them, remove barriers, figure out which ones are true deal breakers, which ones are not, and lean into your peers to simplify and drive efficiency and help tell this story in a way that they'll hear it. I'll leave you with that.
I like that. lean into the peers, help each other, learn from each other. I think it's a great place to end. So Joe, thank you so much for joining us today on Plug and Pay. Lots of really good insights and
It's been fun.
stories that you were able to share with myself and with the listeners. And thank you very much to the listeners for joining us today. If you like what you're hearing here, then make sure you subscribe and follow us. You can find the podcast on YouTube, on Spotify, and any other podcast channel. So thank you again so much for joining us, and see you again soon.